Test 1, 2, 3. This is a test 1, 2, 3. Test 1, 2. This picture of Billie Holiday.
This was the first time I was in Sweden. It was in 1954, and I got to do a tour around Europe. I was there with Red Norvo, and I got to play behind Billie Holiday, and it was one of the high points of my life in many ways. The pianist is Carl Drinkard. Behind the back in the wings there, you can see Buddy DeFranco waiting to come on. The drummer is Elaine Layton, and if you can look close at me, you can see that I'm glued to her. My focus is right on her and nowhere else.
Wow.
There's another one with her. Maybe put your portable for a second. This was a couple of years later in a recording studio with Jimmy Rolls, the pianist. We did altogether 7 recording sessions together, or 6 rather. I had to have a sub on the first one. She was lovely. She was just great.
How long did you work with Billie Holiday? Was it...
Well, it was sporadically from 54 to 57. 54 was his tour around Europe. That was a month. 55, she came and did a month in a club in Los Angeles called the Avant Garde, and I got to work with her for that month. 56 and 57, we did these recordings for Verve with Ben Webster, Harry Edison, Jimmy Rolls, Barney Kessel, and Alvin Stoller or Larry Bunker on drums.
What was it like working with Billie Holiday?
She was an inspiration. She reduced me to a puddle of tears every time I played with her. She just knocked me totally out. Excuse me, He's coming to play with us.
What does he play?
He plays tenor sax now. He started on alto. His name is Brian Mitchell. He's my brother's son. He's a great saxophonist, if I may say so. This is the first time I've been able to hire him. It's not nepotism, it's nephewtism. It's a little different. And he's coming to play the last weekend at this Colonial House. If it is the last weekend, we'll see how it goes. But he played first saxophone with Ray Charles for 7 years. He's played with a lot of other people. And so we're going to have a trio, Brian and a great piano player, a young guy named Tardo Hammer from New York. Tardo Hammer, as usual, from New York. And so he was just calling. He's working right now. He only gets to call every few days because he's working a Mississippi River steamboat gig.
Wow.
He's having fun with it. But there's no phone for him on the boat. So.
Did you say that could be the Colonial's last gig? Now, isn't this where you just moved to?
We just moved to. We're not sure whether we're going to continue this. What we're doing now is fulfilling or living up to our promises to our friends and family in this case, which unfortunately the owners of Da Vinci's did not do. We had an agreement that went through the end of August, and they just lopped it off. Well, that's another story. We needn't go into that.
Now, you just mentioned your brother. Would this be your brother Whitey?
He was called Whitey. He'd get mad if you call him that now.
Whitey?
Yeah. He's younger than me. He's 4.5 years younger, and so he came up after me, having coincidentally taken up bass at exactly the same time I took up bass. He was in high school then, and I was in the Army in Germany, not writing letters or communicating in any way. When I got home, we found out we had both taken up bass. And he became a really good bass player. His degree, which he couldn't have gotten from Juilliard, he got from Oscar Pettiford, maybe certainly one of the greatest bass players of all time, if not the greatest. Oscar hired him to play on his big band when he went over to cello. A very good bass player. But then he worked his way up to the top of the heap in the New York area in the society music field.
Which was?
which means playing at the White House and all the hoity-toity places where you play this terrible Luke Capuke music, which he hated every second of. Lester Lannon, do you know the name Lester Lannon? Well, he was a leader of that kind of garbage. He had a A band, a B band, a C band, and on down to E or F, I think. And my brother worked his way up to the A band. And one night, Lester Lannon said to him in the middle of a job, "You know what the trouble with you is? You're not playing in the middle of the beat." And he said to Lester Lannon, "You know what the trouble with you is? You're full of shit." And that was the end of his career in the society world, which was kind of a blessing in disguise, I think, because that was 1965. And he called me in Los Angeles and asked me if I thought he could be a comedy writer and if he could support himself on bass in the meantime. And I said, certainly, come on out to Hollywood. I had moved out there starting more or less in 52. We were brought up in New Jersey. I was born in New York City. Anyway, so I rented them a little house, and I spoke to some of the people I had worked for out in Los Angeles, Steve Allen and his whole staff, Carl Reiner, Bill Dana, all those guys. And I spoke to about 12 people, and some helped and some didn't. And he came out and did very well as a comedy writer, and that's what he's still doing.
Well, now you put out a record with him and also
Blue Mitchell.
Right?
That's right, yeah.
What was that called?
Yeah, called Get Those Elephants Out of Here. That was about that time when we both started to play bass. I got out of the Army, he got out of high school, and we were still living at home for a few months, and we were buying and choosing basses, and we had basses all over the living room floor. It looked like an elephant graveyard or something. My mother would come down and say, "Get those elephants out of here."
Well, did you do a record called Red, Whitey, and Blue?
Yes, and that was, of course, a joke on the names. Blue got his nickname because his skin was so black that it literally was blue-black. And he was a great trumpet player. Played with Horace Silver and Earl Bostic and a lot of people. He was a fantastic player. And the producer was Leonard Feather, who loves a pun. He went for the joke. And
so did you and your brother both play bass on that, and then you had?
Yes, I doubled. I played piano on some tracks, and then some we played both. We both played bass. Yeah.
Yeah, I had to check that out. My father called me this morning. I told him I was interviewing you today, and he was on KKGO for years. He was on KSFO in San Francisco, then on KKGO for years. And
oh, really?
His name's Dick McGarvin. He was on Sunday afternoons, like 12 to 4 or something like that, for about 15 years.
I wonder if I haven't met him along the way.
Well,
perhaps even done an interview.
Maybe. He never said that he had talked to you, so I don't think that he ever had a chance to interview you. But he's the jazz historian in my family, and he's been a great mentor and influence for me in jazz.
Interesting.
And when I told him that I was interviewing you today, he called me up and said, "Oh, ask him about the Red, Whitey, and Blue."
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. There is a little story there. Andre Previn was on the album. We only had one day to do it. I was in New York working with Andre Previn at the time. They flew Blue Mitchell up from Miami to do it. As I say, Leonard Feather was the producer. And let's see, we had... I think it was, the trombonist was very good. Frank Rehack on trombone. And it seems though we had somebody else on it. Now I'm going to hurt somebody if I leave somebody out. But Frankie Capp was on drums. And we had written some arrangements, my brother and I. There was one arrangement we did where... as I say, we only had one day to do this, and we had to get back to work at the nightclub that night, Andre and Frank Capp and I. And so we made one take on a tune which my brother had arranged, where the arrangement came out good, and everybody played a good solo, except Andre Previn. And then we made another take where everything went wrong, but Andre Previn played a great piano solo. And so after everybody went home, we had about 2.5 hours before we had to get to work. the mixer and Leonard and I stayed, and we tried to jam that good piano chorus into the good take. The mixer was going crazy. He had small bits of tape. He'd have one note over here. We were looking for a place where he could splice it, and it would fit musically. He finally threw up his hands after, I think, about 2.5 hours, something like that. He says, "Can't do it. We're going to have to use the protection tape." Okay. So he got really mad, and he reeled it off, this whole handful of tape, 2 handfuls, threw it in the wastebasket. And I said, "Wait a minute." And I took it out of the wastebasket and stuffed it in my pocket. And that night when I went to work, I asked Andre, I said, "You remember that good chorus you played on that one take?" And he said, "Yeah." And the other take that was, everything else was good. And I told him what happened. We tried to fit it in. I said, "I'm awfully sorry we couldn't do it, but here's your good chorus." Anyway.
You can save it forever.
Yeah.
That's funny. It's interesting to hear stories like that about production. Now everything's all digital, and you don't ever have to have wads of tape. And
Right.
It must have been really amazing to try to edit music that way.
Yeah. Well, musically it would still be the same thing today. You'd still have to find a hole in the music where the good stuff ended and the bad stuff started, and then a corresponding hole in the other take which occurred at the same time.
Right.
And that was the hard part.
Yeah. Backtrack a little bit and start from the beginning. How were you first introduced to music?
Well, we had it in our house before we were born, loud and clear. My father was a true music lover. He made his living as an engineer, working for AT&T, but his first love was really music. He studied opera. He played the pipe organ. He had one organ after the other in the house. First it was a little S.D. Reed organ, and then it was a big S.D. Reed organ, then it was a pipe organ. Then the house got too small, and we moved so he would have more space for a larger pipe organ, which he built, the second one. And then that house got too small, and they moved out to Buddy Cole's house. Buddy had died of a heart attack. Buddy Cole was Bing Crosby's accompanist, and he had an enormous organ studio that he'd built right next to his house. And my parents just happened to come out to Los Angeles and were looking for a house at the exact same time as Buddy Cole's widow was trying to sell this house with the organ studio. So that was just a coincidence. That worked out great.
And you took lessons, saxophone lessons and piano lessons?
Well, I started trying to fool around with the piano when I was a baby. I can remember reaching up to the keyboard when it was, up here somewhere, and trying to make fun of my father's music, which was strictly classical, and imitate it. And by the time I was 5, my father figured it was high time I started with lessons. And we had a teacher in our little town in New Jersey, and it was my mother's job to see to it that I practiced every day. I studied classical for 9 years and never really took to it, not because of the music. I loved the music, and I could hear, for example, my father had hi-fi long before it was called hi-fi. It was just mono, but he had friends who worked in Bell Laboratories and used to smuggle parts out to him, and he had the world's best microphone at that time. I don't know if you remember that. I'm sorry. The big round one with the springs.
Yeah. Yeah.
That was the best mic in the world at that time. He had one of those. He could record direct to disc, and he had a great big speaker baffle, only one speaker, but it was a great sound. So from the time before we were born, as I said, the music was there in the house, loud and clear. He used to turn it up really loud too. He used to say it should be just the same volume as it is when you really hear it.
Yeah.
And, so
how were you introduced to jazz then? Where did jazz come in?
Well, I heard what was going on in the popular world. I was born in 1927, so this was from then till, about 12 years later or so. Let's see. sometime between 12, at the age of 12 and 14, my parents were out of the house one day, and I turned this monster radio on and just happened to get a Count Basie record. And I've told this story a lot, but I couldn't dance then and I can't dance now, but I danced all over the living room, and I decided I had to do something like that. Yeah, it just hit me. It just changed my whole life. I don't remember the exact age, but it's somewhere between 12 and 14.
Did you hear the whole record, or was it just a tune? Do you remember the tune?
It was just one tune, yeah. Later, I've forgotten what it was, but I did a little research at the time and found out what it was. And I remember hearing the rhythm section first, Freddie Green, Walter Page, Count Basie, and Joe Jones. There were 2 solos on it, and I didn't know that they were both by tenor saxophonists, but later I found out they were, and the second one was Lester Young. And when I heard it, I immediately decided that the second, whatever instrument that he was playing, he was the greatest in the world. I just kind of knew it. I don't know how, but I still think I was right about that.
Yeah. Huh.
By the way, we've done this in an interview with Gene Lees, and I have the transcript of it on a fax, 16-page fax.
Oh, wow.
It's coming out in the Jazz Letter.
Oh, it is?
Which has a limited...
I subscribe to that.
Do you?
Yeah.
Oh, well, okay, then you'll see it. I think he has about 1,200 subscribers.
Yeah. Well, yeah, my father got that for Rob and I for Christmas.
Really? Oh, that was nice of him.
Yeah.
He must be a nice man.
He's pretty cool.
Yeah, he must be.
Father.
Yeah.
So you played the famous 52nd Street.
Yes.
Take a sip if you want.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, that was the real school in those days. I tried at Juilliard for 3 months. This was just before they started with jazz. They didn't have any jazz at all at that time, 1947, when I got out of the Army. I studied bass for 3 months, and I only took 2 classes, bass and music appreciation, and the rest of the time I was up in Harlem, which is where Juilliard was at that time, 125th Street, and down on 52nd Street, which was really the Mecca. And so I was really practicing, jamming, and rehearsing for the whole first year, and that first 3 months just taking like 2 hours a week. And
informal training, 2 hours.
Yeah, just music appreciation and bass, and it wasn't a total waste of time. I had a very nice teacher in music appreciation, Marion Bauer, who had written a book about music appreciation, and she was really nice. My bass teacher was Frederick Zimmerman, who was supposed to be the leader of the bass teachers in New York at that time. He had edited the Simandl books, 1 and 2, which are like the Old Testament and the New Testament for bass players. But I had only played about 3 months before I started with him, and I studied with him about 3 months, and at the end of that time he told me, "Forget it, kid." He said, "There's a lot of bass players out there." He said, "What was that other thing you wanted to do?" And I said, "Be an inventor." He said, "Yeah, do that. There's a lot more money in that," he said. Anyway, as I said, this is all in the Jazz Letter.
Okay.
I could give you a transcript. Well, we have one fax copy of it, which I could let you have. It's going to come out anyway. So, as I say, that what we were doing was jamming in studios around New York. We would each put in $2 and rent a studio for a few hours, or rehearsing, or practicing in the hotel room. And I had rented a room in a private apartment for the first 3 months. Anyway.
In the first 3 months, this is right after you got out of the Army.
Yeah, it was like the fall of 47.
So you took up the bass just prior to getting out.
That's right.
Okay. I had the idea that you had picked it up while you were in the Army and got fairly proficient during the Army.
No, not proficient. Just feeling my way, the first.
But really, you'd only had it for 3 months.
Yeah.
You got out, and
Right.
I see. Huh.
And I had thought I was going to be an inventor up until that time. It was this experience in this Army band that really turned me around. Although I should say to go back to where we were before, when I was 14, my teacher died. That was the end of the classical lessons. And that's when I really started to get interested in jazz, trying to learn to play bebop on the piano. Well, I tried to play boogie woogie first, and then some of the popular music of the day, and then got around to bebop. And it wasn't until I was 19 that I finally chose the bass. But in this Army band in Europe, I was there 8 months. And by the way, the bass player in that band lives in Lake Oswego now. I was the piano player. And he's a dear friend, Lou Caldarelli. Anyway, he's not playing anymore. But so this first 3 months in New York, what we were doing was sitting in different places. We would all walk around the streets with our instruments and sit in, especially 52nd Street. That was where they had one club next to another, both sides of the street, all doing good business, all cutting each other's throats, an accumulation of talent there that I don't think will ever be possible again. Not on one block.
Who was there when you were doing this? Who were you sitting with?
Well, all kinds of people. My first steady job came from sitting in with a piano player whose name then was Adrian George. He's since changed it. He had changed it 6 times up till then. Now he's in California, Santa Barbara, and his name is Fletcher Peck. Anyway. What was going on was the clubs on 52nd Street, which were all more or less owned by the same criminal organization, don't have to name it, were hiring single piano players to play intermissions in many cases, knowing full well that there was a whole coterie of bass players and drummers and horn players that would love to come in and sit in and play with the single piano player. Well, Adrian George had written a lot of his own songs, and he was an arranger too. And that kind of drove him crazy. He went to the boss of one of these places, the Onyx Club, one time and said, couldn't I just give a bass player and a drummer a token sum so that I can say I have my own trio and I can play my own stuff and no sitting in? And they said, okay. So they agreed to pay us $15 a week each, the drummer and I. And what they didn't know was that we would have paid them if we could have to do that. So we learned some of his tunes, and that was it. That was a set trio then, the Adrian George trio, no sitting in. So that was my first job. It was 2 months like that.
So was that one of the first trios? I mean, sort of real...
That I played with, yeah. It was the first really organized trio, I guess. And the first month was opposite Charlie Parker with his quintet, with Miles Davis and Tommy Potter, Duke Jordan, and Max Roach. And that was an education. That's, as I say, that's where the real school was, Yeah. I was sitting there the first night. We played the first set. And then I got off, and I was sitting almost, cupping my ear, waiting for Bird to start. And Bird came over to me and stuck his hand out and introduced himself. In his radio announcer voice, he had a lot of different sounds. He could sound like anybody you could think of. He could do dialects, or he was a very funny man, in addition to being extremely intelligent, a true genius. He stuck his hand out and he said, "Good evening, I don't think I've had the pleasure of meeting you. My name is Charlie Parker." And I said, and I was in total awe. And he asked me if I'd sit in with him, their first set. And I said, no, thank you. No, some other year, I would love to, but I'm not ready yet. He insisted. He spoke to the bass player, Tommy Potter. He got up and made an announcement, got a round of applause, and waved me up on the stand. And I had to. And that was my first trial by fire, I'm glad I hope nobody recorded that. If anybody did, it was probably Dean Benedetti. He was there with a tape recorder, or a wire recorder at that time.
He has a reputation, that's for sure.
That's right, and his girlfriend was working in the cloakroom of the Onyx Club at the time. So he might have recorded it, but I don't think. But he never recorded anything but Charlie Parker's solos, so I think I'd be spared the agony of trying to hear myself.
Why, isn't there a whole? Hasn't that been reissued or issued? Not reissued, but issued.
Issued,
now?
yes,
Yeah.
for the first time. That's right.
And it's nothing but the Charlie Parker.
That's
solos.
right. It cuts off as soon as he plays his last note. That's it. He didn't have enough wire. Yeah. He was poor. He was a tenor player, and he didn't have any money at all. It was a Webcore. I don't know if you remember Webcore wire recorders before tape.
Wow. No, I'd have to look that up.
Well, another Webcore wire recorder that I got to see was John Lewis's. Shortly after that first gig, as I say, Bird had Miles in his group at that time. Miles asked me to be in the Birth of the Cool band, and it didn't have that name at that time. He just said, "Would you like to make some rehearsals?" And I said, "Yes, indeed." And it was a totally experimental thing at the time, and now we realize way ahead of its time. It set the tone for the 50s and well into the 60s. And John Lewis would come with his Webcore wire recorder and record the rehearsals.
Now, when you said at the time he wasn't calling it Birth of the Cool, is that right?
No, that was an afterthought.
Okay. When Miles asked you to be a part of that, was that in New York, or had then you moved to...
No, that was in New York.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So it was initiated there, and then, if I'm just getting my history right, what's been dubbed as the Birth of the Cool was the West Coast jazz sound. Is that?
Well, you're right. It was an interesting phenomenon. It started with that band.
Which actually started in New York.
In New York, yes, it did.
Irony.
Yeah, there are a lot of ironies about the idea of West Coast and East Coast jazz. That is one of them. That band really started it. It was picked up on in the West Coast more than it was picked up on in the East Coast. Shorty Rogers and Marty Paich and all of those guys started writing like that. The first time I heard Hampton Hawes was in I got a little feedback from that. It was in 1952. Hamp had recorded with a band like that with Shorty Rogers, and I heard it in Rudy Van Gelder's control room in 1952. That was the West Coast answer to the Birth of the Cool band. And I remember the piano solo distinctly. I thought at the time, I'd like to play with that guy sometime. It influenced the whole decade and more.
I've just heard this whole business of East Coast and West Coast, since I've been doing also the profile on Leroy Vinegar. I have heard more perceptions about what the East Coast, West Coast jazz movement and how they differed and how it started. Everybody you talk to has a completely different story.
I suppose so, according to their point of view. I found that out about life. There are an infinite number of perceptions of any one thing, according
to... Teddy Edwards said that the West Coast jazz movement was started by the head of Pacific Records.
Well, I know who you're talking about, Dick Bach, and he had the first record company. I think Teddy Edwards was right about that as far as the first really West Coast jazz record company. By the way, Teddy Edwards was the first really bebop West Coast tenor player I heard. He was really into bebop first before any of the other West Coast tenor players. Some of the real honest-to-God West Coast tenor players who aren't thought of as West Coast musicians are, for example, Dexter Gordon, Zoot Sims, Harold Land, they were born and brought up on the West Coast. Most of the musicians who were called West Coast musicians went through the same trip I did, moved from New York out there, like Shelley Mann and Shorty Rogers and all the others. Jazz took a trip, something like the trip up the Mississippi from New Orleans to Chicago, you know. In this case, it was from the East Coast to the West Coast, partly because of the living conditions, partly for the same reasons I moved to Salem recently. People are nice here. It was easier living. There was a more relaxed atmosphere in California at that time. It was people weren't as stressed out as people in New York. The tempo of life was slower. There was something to the laid-back feeling that came out of some of the bands in the West Coast because they lived that way. The first mention of West Coast jazz that I've ever seen was in 1947 by Nat Cole. He wrote an article. They had a 1947 Esquire yearbook, which, if you could, you should get a copy of because it's kind of historical. Frank Sinatra wrote a little thing in it where he was saying how much he loved jazz, if only because it was at least integrated. It didn't matter how you looked, it was how you sounded. And Nat Cole wrote this article. I don't know if the title of the article was West Coast Jazz or he used the phrase in his article. I don't remember for sure. But that was the first mention of West Coast jazz I ever saw. And that was, I say, 5 years before I moved out there. And then I wrote a tune called the East Coast Outpost, the idea being that we were going to swing just as hard out there as we did in New York. And there were true West Coast piano players like Hampton Hawes, born and brought up in Los Angeles, who swung as hard as anybody. And it was about hard swinging, or, you know, the next movement after the cool was, as you know, now really started in New York, was called hard bop. And like so many categories, it's leaky, you know.
So now then hard bop was the East Coast thing.
Yeah, that was like Horace Silver's music and so on. Art Blakey's music. Everybody loved Horace Silver and Art Blakey. Nobody was trying to get away from that, you know.
Les McCann's answer to the East Coast, West Coast question was that it was just the East Coast cats wanting to one-upsman the West Coast. I mean, it was nothing but who's better than. When that was his answer, and then Teddy Edwards' answer was more of a racial issue. You know, that it was more of a racial issue than it was about the music.
Well, I think they're both right to a degree. I love both of those guys, and I think, by the way, Les McCann was another one of the hard-swinging West Coasters. The racial thing came in through the de facto segregation of Los Angeles, of the entire Los Angeles area, as opposed to New York City, which was much more integrated. Of course, New York City was segregated too. I think both New York and Los Angeles are more integrated now than they were then, but we still have de facto segregation, as you know, all over the country. There was a perfect example of the irony of that one time when Leonard Feather did a blindfold test with Miles Davis, and he played a record that had a tenor solo by Buddy Collette. Do you know who Buddy Collette is? Buddy Collette is known as a West Coast saxophonist. He's a tall, dignified person who has a lot of luck with women and plays usually in a laid-back way, although one time I heard Buddy, when he got mad at somebody because they were coming on to his woman, and that's how I'll always remember him. He was a hard swinger at heart. He just didn't have to get around to it all the time. But they played this record for Miles Davis in this blindfold test, and Miles said, "All those white tenor players sound alike to me." And so whether Miles knew who it was and was putting us all on, or I'll never know.
Right.
But there was the irony. There was the irony. There was a really dark-skinned tenor player who sounded, or who Miles Davis said sounded like all the other white guys to him. So that's how ironic it gets.
It's very convoluted. I mean, I've been, my editor in Washington, D.C. at NPR is like, has requested that I address where do these bass players fall in the sound, in the East Coast, West Coast sound. And it's like, you can't nail it down. You can't pin it down.
No. I must say I made one chauvinistic remark. I remember it because I felt guilty when I made it in my life about that. It was when I got out there and I'd played with a few drummers, and then I got to play with Shelly Manne one night at a session. And Shelly had such a great beat. He had such great time, as we say. He just knocked me out. And when we finished the first tune, I said, man, there's still nothing like that New York time. And I felt guilty when I said it, because I knew it was dumb. It wasn't that New York time. It was Shelly Manne. He played the same on the West Coast as he did on the East Coast. And he invented a lot of the drum licks that the avant-gardists think they made up today. He was a great drummer. He was a great inventor. And he went out there for the same reason I did. It was a lot nicer life.
Probably, so the critics that had to make the distinction.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. We who play the music have been fooled so many times. I mean, we don't consider ourselves experts. I've been fooled so many times that we would not set ourselves up as arbiters of such boundary lines. No musician would ever set himself up as an arbiter of such a categorical division. Cannonball tried to do that one time. Nat Adderley told me. Cannonball said he could tell whether a guy was black or white by listening to him. And so Nat gave him a blindfold test, and he was wrong 3 times out of 5. So, what the hell. I don't think any musician would ever set himself up in that position. Yeah. But the critics have done that. They seem to feel obliged to be coming from a position over us somehow.
Let's see. All right, now we've handled the philosophical question. Let's get on with your life story.
Okay. Well, okay. That was part of it. We can go on actually in the same. When I started going into New York from New Jersey, just after I got out of the Army, I lived at home for a few months first. Then when I started to go into the city, and I started meeting these people that had played this great music that I'd been hypnotized by, I noticed that I was not treated like a funny-looking little half a Huckleberry Finn, which I had been treated like in my hometown. It didn't matter how you looked. It was how you sounded. And that moved me deeply. They drew me in socially, aside from the music, I said, okay, they made me feel welcome.
This is when you went in to play on 52nd Street.
Yeah. I was made to feel welcome. And for the first time in my life, I always felt like an outcast. And, freckles and big teeth and red hair. I was just, skinny, ugly. One of my lifetime goals has been to get a little less ugly from year to year.
It must be working.
Well, thank you. Just sleight of hand.
So, with regard to the language of bebop, when you started to first get on the scene, we're talking 1949 now at 52nd Street.
No, that was 47. I'm sorry, 48. I was sitting in 47. I was able to go in and listen from 45, 44, 45, 46. I was able to just get on a bus in New Jersey and go in and listen when I was in high school, which I'm very thankful for. I got to meet some of these people then, before I started playing. For example, Dizzy Gillespie's big band, I got to meet those guys in 1946. I heard Ray Brown with Dizzy's big band in 1946, and that was one of the experiences that made me believe that I might be able to do that. First of all, that you could play bebop on the acoustic bass.
Was it called bebop at that time?
Yeah, there were some people who were saying rebop, and then there was a critic who tried to start a new category and called it advanced rebop, and then...
What was it with rebop? Taken from what?
Well, singing the licks, probably.
Oh.
You know, the scat singing that Dizzy used to do. And actually, there's a Louis Armstrong record that was done in 1927 where he says the word bebop loud and clear. I think it was that historic recording where he dropped the lyric. The lyric fell off the music stand, and he's scatting, and he said bebop loud and clear. That was the first documented use of the word that I know of, 1927. But among the musicians, it was bebop or bop.
But that language was just beginning to come into its own in
That's
the
right.
40s, right?
Yeah, about the middle 40s, you could say. That's right.
So you were able to listen to this language, this musical language, and felt a passion for it.
Yes.
And then, did you then specifically set out to also try to speak that language yourself as a bass player? I mean,
yes.
You modeled yourself after
Yes,
that
I
language?
did. Having started with the previous language, swing, I had started to try to play alto saxophone in, I think it was 42, 43, 44, 45. Yeah, 42 in high school. And at that time, my idol was Johnny Hodges. And I loved Benny Carter and Earl Bostic and Pete Brown, and on clarinet, Edmund Hall was my favorite, and so on. So that was Duke Ellington, Count Basie. I loved Lester Young. Of course, he was my champ from the beginning and still is. Mm-hmm. Someday I think they're going to be able to figure out on a computer who communicated best of all. I don't know how they're going to do that, but...
Well, now you have an engineering background. Maybe that's your next...
That would be fun to try sometime. But I think it's going to turn out to be Lester Young.
And then, so as a bass player... where do you see yourself in the falling in the chronology of bass players?
Yeah, that's a good question. My first favorites were Slam Stewart and Oscar Pettiford. Mm-hmm. And then there were a lot of other people playing more or less in that style at the time, but I thought not quite as well. Those were the two greatest, I thought. And when I started playing bass, they are still. I mean, even though they've died, that doesn't change what they did. They still are two of the greatest bass players ever. I guess this first Count Basie record that I heard was with Walter Page. And that era got into my blood first. Then, one of the first bebop records I think I heard was the one that Red Norvo made with Dizzy and Bird, Congo Blues and Slam Slam Blues and all those things. And I heard Dizzy first. I mean, Dizzy got to me just about a second before Charlie Parker did, if you know what I mean. And Slam already had, and Red Norvo, of course, and the other players. But then I heard, these 78s would come out one at a time, you know, Parker's Mood and those things. In fact, I remember in the Army in 1946, in Camp Lee, Virginia, two friends of mine from Chicago, Hotsy Katz and Cy Tuff, were there, and they had a little tinny record player, and they had this 78 of Now's the Time with Billy's Bounce on the other side, and that's the first time I ever heard Miles Davis. And then, too, it just went all through me. I just broke down and cried, and I said, "Who's that?" I said, "Oh, boy, that trumpet chorus that Miles played, that just killed me. I just couldn't I had to hear it again and again and again and again. And it didn't sound like bebop to me. Or I had to say at the time, well, he's got his own kind of bebop. It's not Dizzy Gillespie. It's not Fats Navarro. He's got his own kind of bebop. There were piano players. One of the first days I was in the Army in 1946 at Camp Kilmer, New Jersey, I was sent to the kitchen, as usual. The sergeant there said, wash those, scrub that, and then carry those out, And I said, yes, sir. And I walked directly to the service club. And there was a piano player playing Boogie Woogie. He got up, another piano player sat down, a long, tall guy that looked like a basketball player, and started playing his own kind of bebop. Now, I'd heard Bud Powell, and to me that was bebop piano, what Bud Powell played. Here comes another guy playing his own kind of bebop, and it was equally authentic. And it was Randy Weston. And this is like my first day in the Army. I said, Jesus, it's going to be like this? This is going to be great. Well, he was on his way out. And later I got to hear Elmo Hope on the West Coast, who was from Philadelphia, I believe. Elmo also had his own kind of bebop, equally authentic. His tunes were just as hard as Monk's tunes to learn, but equally authentic. Thelonious Monk, another perfect example, guy had his own kind of bebop. So the category covered a lot of people who played completely different.
Well, and then so it just sounds like bebop was what the critics needed to describe and label the new kind of music, but it allowed for each player, each musician to find their own voice.
It did, yes. Milt Jackson once said, "I'd like to meet the guy that laid that category on us," or something like that.